Welcome back to my Raven's Tail video series where I talk about all the discussed links between psychology, self-healing, and imaginal narratives. So today we're talking about Snow White, a cute little story about a girl who talks to animals and meets funny little dwarves. Or is it? Snow White is actually very dark. Much like Hansel and Gretel, it does not play around. It depicts vicious cruelty and darkness packaged in a funny, kid-friendly narrative that I think is like all folk tales that have passed muster as surviving generations of storytelling, a unique expression of a particular complex and not only its consequences, but its resolution. So here's the story. Snow White has skin white as snow and lips red as blood. A magic mirror tells her stepmother that, however, that Snow White is more beautiful than she is. The stepmother orders a hunter to kill Snow White, but the hunter substitutes another animal's heart and saves her. Snow White then goes to a house of dwarves, or in some versions it's thieves, who adopt her as their sister, quote unquote. The stepmother then shape changes into a kindly old woman who tries to poison her at first with lace, then with a comb, then finally with an apple. Each time she dies from the poison, but the dwarves revive her except the last time. They can't revive her the last time, and so they put her in a glass coffin. Well, a prince then comes along, revives her with a kiss, then marries her, and at the wedding, the stepmother is made to dance herself to death in red hot shoes. This one is a little darker than Hansel and Gretel, and it has a bit more mysticism in it, but it contains the key to the particular injury that Snow White suffers in a more direct parental aggression rather than neglect, is what you saw in Hansel and Gretel. Snow White has murderous intent from a parental figure, and the horrendous consequences of it are depicted in the story. There's animal death, there's shamanic triple death, and there's finally torture. It's savage. And then there's the business with the dwarves or the thieves, all surrounding this cutthroat business that is the dark side of female competition for status striving. And like other folk tales, like Hansel and Gretel and Rumpelstiltskin, it shows not only the species typical situation, but the consequences and the cure for it, all wrapped in a dreamlike symbolic narrative of hope. Let's explore. I once knew of someone who strongly identified with Snow White. This is a real person I'm talking about, and that's when I realized just how psychologically accurate this folk tale is, because this person became very captured in this complex, had a lot of the same things happen to her that happens to Snow White in a general way. But she never quite escaped, unfortunately. The setup of the story is that of a mother figure being directly aggressive towards Snow White due to her status striving. Now, men and women both status strive. Women just use different weapons than men do. Arguably, those weapons are more deadly than the brute force that you see in male striving. Whereas male power derives from brute strength and aggression, female power derives from looks and subtlety. It's important not to underestimate how powerful this can be. Snow White is hated by her stepmother, the queen, because of her innocent beauty. It's a threat to her power, so she sees. And so she seeks to destroy Snow White. Thus, you see here the silent pledge of an older woman to mentor and nurture a young woman is betrayed. Does this happen in real life? Yeah, it definitely does. And Snow White shows us the dire consequences of this for her. Through the queen's machinations, Snow White's animal heart is sacrificed. This betrayal costs the heart of an animal directly compared to Snow White's heart. In a dream, if this were a dream, this would be recognized as the animal and Snow White are connected, and so the animal's death is a way to depict her free and playful spirit slaughtered by this aggression. It's not pretty, and it gets worse. She's forced to flee into the dark forest. In this case, a retreat into the complex, which engulfs her. She comes to live among these seeming friends of dwarves or thieves. I think that's very telling. This shows us that as a result of this betrayal, she is forced to become an outcast. She's forced to become marginalized. In real life, this might mean getting in with the wrong crowd or getting involved in criminal or at least marginalized activities by association. It's notable that she flees into the arms of multiple men, too. It could as easily have been just one, but it's many. And they adopt her as their sister. So her ability to bond with females is shown here to be completely damaged. And she's only able to bond with men. Therefore, this shows some complexity as well, because this isn't depicted as necessarily harmful in and of itself, which it isn't. That's how interesting this is, because it's quite realistic, and it's not just a simplistic thing of fleeing into the den of thieves is automatically bad. After all, they don't actually victimize her. They provide temporary solace from the queen's wrath. Nevertheless, they can't protect her from it, notably. And even though they don't victimize her, they don't really have to in this story. In real life, they would possibly do this, and I've certainly seen evidence of this. But folktales, remember, are very spare and efficient. The solution to the victimizing dwarves and thieves would be actually the same as the original attack that put her there in the first place. At this point now, she has to die 3 times. She must die to the idea of beauty as a measure of worth. That's ultimately what's going on here. The queen's tragedy is that she sees her worth only through the lens of her beauty. The solution is what happens next. She must die 3 times to this idea. That's how hard it is. You can't just die once to it. You got to do it 3 times. And if you'll notice, the gifts are beauty gifts. There's a comb, and then there's the lace, and then finally the apple. The apple's a beautiful fruit that she has to actually take into herself. And that's what affects the death, because she actually eats it up, literally in the story. Remember, these are very concretized visual spatial metaphors of things that are more subtle in their depiction. So this death, the dwarves can't revive her from. Then she is presented to the world in a glass coffin and magically remains beautiful. This is telling us that we're deeply in the imagination now, not quite in the real world. We're witnessing archetypal dynamics. I mean, we're in the real world, but we're depicting it via these images rather than in a literal sense. This part here tells us that we have to incubate this. After that death, it's not just a simple poof, everything's wonderful and hunky-dory. Folktales are never quite that simple. They never allow for the easy solutions. You've always got to go through all this hard work to get there, which is why they are so useful and interesting for psychology. In any case, only when she does this does the prince arrive. Now, you can look at this as just random prince shows up, but you got to remember this is dream logic. It's a when-then logic. In other words, once this happened, then this other thing happens. So in this sense, the redeeming element within her that is personified as the prince arrives unlooked for. You can't seek it out. You've got to wait for it to come. This is very much like active imagination. In other words, you can't force it with the ego. That's what's really key here. Now, the prince arrives. He values her without any of the finery that the queen tried to tempt her with, interestingly enough. Now, I think the reason why, you could criticize this from sort of a modern social political perspective and say, well, Snow White's very passive. This isn't very, good or whatever. But there's a real psychological reason why Snow White is so passive here. And it's because of the realism that is being shown with respect to the inner dynamics that are being symbolized. Follow me? In other words, she has to allow these deaths to happen to her at a level deeper than the ego. We have to allow it to passively enter into our bones and our feelings. That's how powerful this must be. The triple death in and of itself is often seen in rites of initiation, and you can see it in mythology also. It's a very powerful way to affect psychological healing and transformation, which is the means through which the complex is escaped. Now that she leaves the complex, i.e. the house in the woods, which, like all complexes, are safe, but they're prisons, then she gets to be with the prince and become and be married to him and become part of society again. It's interesting to remember, like Hansel and Gretel's gingerbread house, the king's castle and Rumpelstiltskin. Both of these are depictions of the safe but prison-like nature of a complex. She then, at this point, marries the masculine and feminine energies together. In other words, she marries the prince. and you get this alchemical marriage and a union. And then what happens to the queen? She's burned to death, just like the witch in Hansel and Gretel. The passion and fuel of fire, again, is the lesson here, destroys the source of the complex. So that's Snow White. In other news today, King of the Forgotten Darkness becomes available for pre-order in the US. You can go check out the link below, or you can just go sign up for my newsletter at ericgoodwyn.com. There's links on the website as well. I used a lot of folktale imagery and in the particular mystical way that you see used here to write King of the Forgotten Darkness. I avoided sort of easy, explicit agendas that sometimes you see when people use psychology to inform novel writing. Anyway, go check it out, see what you think, or pre-order a copy, and I'll see you next time.